Hi. Hello. Here in my little makeshift studio for this morning, instead of being with you, I'm really, really sorry I can't be there in person for today's important, this weekend's important conference, but today's important panel discussion. I was really looking forward to it, but following complications from some recent surgery I had, um, my recovery's had a bit of a hiccup and I can't travel anywhere. So I'm gutted, but it does give me a little bit of empathy with those elite players who we're talking about in this session, who sometimes get an injury which rules them out of a important, crucial game. So, as I said, my name's Sam Feeney, and as well as being an LGBT community activist, I'm also a trade union and labour activist, and a proud lily white supporter of Spurs. Um, Furthermore, I'm a counsellor, so I work mainly with young people in the third sector, but I also have a small private practice offering therapy, training, and consultancy, with a special interest in trauma of all kinds, and with working with gender and sexual diversity issues with clients. On top of that, I'm a proud and shame-free trans man, and I identify as a bisexual, pansexual, queer, depending on who I'm with and which way the wind's blowing on any particular day. If anyone saw A Very English Scandal, the powerful dramatisation of former Liberal Party leader Jeremy Thorpe on BBC over recent weeks, you may have heard someone use the phrase queer as springtime. It's a phrase that me and some of my friends and colleagues, therapist colleagues, would love to see on those monitoring forms that we're all expected to fill in these days. That's me, queer as springtime and a non-binary trans man for the icing on the cake. At various points in my 51 years, I've wrapped myself in many of the rainbow colours of our Three Lions Pride, lived most of my life prior to transition as a very out lesbian. If you were at the screening of the wonderful film Just Charlie yesterday evening, you will have heard my introduction explaining my connection to and passion for football. If you missed it, I have shared it on Twitter, and if you follow Pride in Football or John Holmes from Sky Sports, then you can find my words from last night there. But what I'm not is a professional football player, and I've never worked at any level in the game. So you might imagine what insights I could possibly have that would be relevant for an elite player. Working in a hugely different environment to me, but someone who may be on the cusp of coming out as LGBT, or who may indeed be at risk of being outed by others. The more I thought about this before today, the more I connected with some very similar issues that I imagine such a player may face. Issues I've experienced in my own personal and professional life, as well as those I've had the privilege of exploring and helping clients with over the years. And sometimes we forget when we think about elite players that for all their status, their wealth, and what different lives we imagine they might lead, that at the end of the day, they are also human beings, sharing many of the vulnerabilities, the hopes, and the fears that we all do in our different but sometimes similar ways. And I think that this is critical to remember with what we're talking about here. Just because someone is rich, successful, and perhaps quite literally at the top of their game, it doesn't mean that facing any major life event is going to be any easier for them than you or I. And sometimes, and I think especially when we're talking about an elite player coming out as gay or bisexual or even possibly trans, the more successful you are, the more you have to lose. And those fears are very real. And they're also, let's face it, quite understandable fears in what is still a very macho culture at many levels in football. on and off the pitch. You may have noticed that I didn't mention lesbian just then, and that was quite deliberate because I think in many ways the women's game has always had to deal with the issues of lesbians playing football. And I remember well back in the 1980s the fear that was promoted that somehow lesbian was catching and that any girl who played football was at risk of being turned. Those prejudices and stereotypes have had to be addressed in women's and girls' football. And today, when we see the women's game thriving better than it has ever done before, there are out lesbian, bi, and dare I say it, even a few trans women players, coaches and officials, and they're at all levels. But that's not at all the same in men's and boys' football. And why? When in other sports we have been starting to see elite athletes and other sports professionals beginning to come out over recent years. Why are we not seeing the same in men's professional football? We know that there are gay and bisexual players, certainly playing at a grassroots level in five-a-side teams and Sunday League, and they're likely playing at all levels in the game, but they're just not out. And I've been reflecting a lot on the changes we've seen over the last 30 odd years recently, as just last month we had the 30th anniversary of when Section 28 came into law, and last year we saw the 50th anniversary of when homosexuality was decriminalised. Social attitudes and the law have certainly advanced hugely over that time, and we've seen a growing acceptance, indeed an embracing of LGBT people's right to be treated with dignity and respect across a wide range of society, and many cultural differences too, but still not in men's football. My own feeling is that apart from the still strong attachment to a certain very old-fashioned and macho, sexist and heterosexual view of masculinity in football culture, it's still too common. And any player who might even think about coming out as anything other than a red-blooded, skirt-chasing, bantering, straight guy knows only too well what happened to the one and only elite football player who ever came out in the English game. I'm talking, of course, about Justin Fashanu, who faced homophobic and racist, hideous abuse, harassment, threats, violence, and rejection, both on and off the pitch, from other players, from managers, from the media, and also from his own family. Last month it was the 20th anniversary of Justin's suicide. And it's such a stark and chilling reminder to anyone who wonders why we have not had any elite male footballer come out since then. It's no wonder when the stakes seem so high. And with stakes like that, will we ever see professional footballers feel able to be open about their sexual or gender identities and begin to change the homophobic and macho culture that pervades so many parts of the football world? Well, this is where I do now have hope, and far more hope than I might have had even just a few years ago. I am sensing a real shift going on with men, and not just in football, but across sport and across society now. It's not yet reached that point where I think any player who wants to come out is going to feel that everything will be okay and he won't have anything to lose in doing so. But those first cultural changes are certainly beginning to happen. We saw a beautiful example of this quite seismic shift underway just this week when Danny Rose spoke openly about his own experiences of depression, mental health difficulties, and his fears over racism for his family about going to Russia for the World Cup. We mustn't underestimate how powerful and courageous a step this was for Danny in exposing publicly aspects of himself that were some of the most vulnerable parts of his being. We've seen similar with Leon McKenzie, the former Premiership footballer and professional boxer who now runs his own mental health awareness and advocacy project. We've seen it with Rio Ferdinand and the extraordinarily moving documentary he did with his children following the story of their bereavement journey after his wife died. we are starting to see high-profile men across different sports and other fields show their huge strength in allowing themselves to be vulnerable and revealing aspects of themselves that has long been considered to be not what you do if you want the respect of the men around you. We've also witnessed in recent years the now very many adult men who've come forward to talk about their own experiences of being abused by older men in football, as with every other corner of society. It is hugely stressful to try and keep under wraps any aspect of yourself that causes pain, hurt or suffering. It can not only damage your mental health, but it can also impact on your physical health, your fitness and your personal and professional relationships, as any sports psychologist will tell you. While any decision to come out has to be that of a player themselves, living constantly with a mask on is incredibly stressful, with the constant fear that you might be found out or that your story is leaked to the gutter press. As we saw only last month when, even in 2018, The Sun feels it's okay to print a salacious story about an unnamed Premiership player who is apparently bisexual. Everyone who takes into confidence others about a personal private matter like their sexual or gender identity absolutely must have that respected and be empowered to decide for themselves if and how they want that to be known to others. But now that prominent men in football are beginning to break down the walls of silence around so many different issues, perhaps they are also clearing a space for those men living under a burden of stigma and shame about their sexuality, to see that they too can be open about themselves, who they are, who they love, that if they came out they will have the respect of their teammates, the coaches and others in the game, as well as the dedicated support not only of their club's LGBT supporters group and others around the whole of Pride in Football, but others and other supporters and the whole of Three Lions Pride. It's never easy to come out, whoever you are, quite apart from if you are someone in the public eye, seen as a role model for children and others, and with so much pressure to be performing at your very best week in, week out on the pitch and off it. It's perfectly normal to have huge fears about taking a risk and revealing something that once shared publicly is going to stay with you for life. Fears about who to tell and how you go about it, fears over the impact it might have on your contract, on your performance, on your relationships with your team, your club and your loved ones. Fears over what the media is going to say. Fears about how much abuse you might face. The list of anxieties is long and it's understandable. But if I could say one thing to any elite player facing this situation now, it would be to invest in getting yourself your own independent personal therapist to help you navigate the journey and help you decide how you want to steer your own ship through the sometimes choppy seas ahead. Get someone experienced in helping others do the same. And I can't recommend highly enough the Pink Therapy Network. They're therapists who are skilled and experienced in this area. It's run by Dominic Davis, who is an internationally renowned and well-respected senior psychotherapist, and he has contacts with similar therapists all over this country and indeed the world. For clubs and everyone involved in football, there are many different ways that players who come out can be supported. Learning from the women's game is one. Getting experienced professionals in to train and support the club's own support staff in working with the player to get a bespoke plan, including communications and media plan, in place to ensure the very best support can be provided for the player, their family and the rest of the team and club. Actually, the trans community and many of us individually have good experience of developing exactly these sorts of bespoke support plans, especially those of us who when we're transitioning at work, particularly when we're working in sensitive sectors where there may be increased prejudices, myths and stereotypes that need challenging in an effective way right from the outset. Please do use us for helping with that. although we do need professionally paying to provide these services, because we already do one hell of a lot for free. Give a prominent platform to your LGBT supporters club, and if there isn't one yet, then that is very much to form part of your plan. Pride in Football is a fantastic resource to utilise for doing this, and already established LGBT fan groups are mentoring others to establish their own. The Football Association and individual clubs could aid this enormously by providing the necessary resources to do this. And remember that while your fears are understandable, actually you may be magnifying some of the risks involved too. I will never forget my first experience of coming out to a young man I was working with at the very beginning of my transition. At the time I worked with young offenders, and this particular young man was from the traveller community, one that is commonly associated with deeply held cultural rules about gendered stereotypes and expectations. And when I was referred to as he by reception staff on him coming in to see me, actually on my very ground zero day, when everyone had been informed by email of my transition, the pronouns to use, etc. But it was all very new to everyone. And I came downstairs to a flustered receptionist who hadn't known what to say to the young man when he'd said, "Oh no, you've got it wrong, Sam's a she." So I went out to greet him and he said straight away, "Oh, I hear you've had an operation," grinning from ear to ear. And I smiled and led him into a meeting room and explained that while I hadn't had an operation yet, I was now transitioning to male. My heart was in my mouth as I'd been working with this young man well over several months, ironically around issues to do with his own view of what being a man meant to him, around violence, around being a new young dad, losing his own father young and being the family provider when that had happened. Anyway, he listened to me intently and he nodded before shaking my hand and saying, "Sam, you've got bigger balls than I have." It was with a tone of such genuine respect that it moved me profoundly and will stay with me for the rest of my life. So the lesson there is never assume the response of anybody else on the basis of your own anxiety and the cultural stereotypes we have all absorbed one way or the other. We can and are proved wrong, and the immense surprising joy from that is really affirming when you might be feeling really vulnerable inside. That's not to say there won't be problems, and sometimes they can indeed be acutely distressing. I've personally been on the receiving end of some targeted transphobic abuse and harassment, including malicious communications with my employer, made by someone who takes great offence at the idea that a trans person can be working with children and young people and considers people like me child abusers. Now, this is in the context of a current and very highly toxic public discourse around proposed positive reforms to the Gender Recognition Act and also affirmative support for trans children and young people. But existing laws around hate abuse and harassment are inadequate in the face of what many people are experiencing in different contexts with the very different landscape of social media that just was not around when these laws were drafted. So it can be challenging at times, but any player who does choose to come out now, I think there has been, on balance, no better time. They would have a great deal of support from a wide range of the public, and I believe now from most of their teammates, club staff and supporters. Once one or two come out, then I don't think it would be long before being a gay or bisexual player at any level in the football would carry the same stigma or shame that it was once so entrenched back in 1988 when we lost Justin Fashanu. Perhaps we lost him as a result of the kind of bigotry that was so long for too long. The chair of Pride in Football, Di Cunningham, was quoted by John Holmes in his article for Sky Sports as saying, "Football has the power to change hearts and minds." And I agree so strongly with that statement. And never more have we needed that spirit of football as we go to Russia for this World Cup and pave the pathway for any footballer who wants to come out with the security he will need to know that we are with him every step of the way. Thank you.